Hey guys, what is up? Super K Man Rocks here, and we're here with my MSI play-ins day number 3 overview and analysis video. By the end of this episode, we are going to know our first two teams to qualify out of the play-in stage into the main stage of MSI, one from Group A, one from Group B, and the third and final team, I guess, to go down into the lower bracket. Obviously, we don't know who they will be playing just yet, but probably the two biggest series of the play-in stage here, or at least the two most interesting, with exclusively major region teams performing. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you're interested in my thoughts on the tournament up until this point, you can check out the playlist in the iCard. You can go ahead and click on that. That's going to have day 1, day 2. It's going to have my primer in there. You can check everything out. That's my thoughts and opinions, not only on these teams from what they've shown over the course of this year, but of course, thoughts on every series that happened on day 1 and 2 in the first round here. But today we are going to be covering, I guess, the winners finals. That's the best way I can describe it here of the play-in stage. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is we go game by game in each series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team is able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be talking about potential theories at the end of the video for what the losing teams here could expect to face at the end of this, MSI play-in tournament, if you will, but most of the time today will be spent on the actual winners finals. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Two really good series here today. Like we said, only major region teams facing off against each other. So no minor regions, no teams that are just a little bit overmatched in terms of the skill level. Obviously, there is still a difference between the teams that are playing here today, but it's not going to be nearly as much as some of the matchups we saw in round number 1. And we kick it off, of course, with Group A before we go into Group B. This is definitely an intriguing one. It's the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1 taking on the number 2 seed from the LCS in FlyQuest, and this is probably the less interesting, I would say, on paper of these two series. Obviously not talking about how I expect to play out. FlyQuest is probably the weakest major region team at this tournament. That's what I had in my power rankings going into it. I think they have a lot of positives, but they certainly have a lot of question marks, and they rely a lot on being able to establish tempo in the early game. Lucky for them, T1's really not the best early game team in the world. If you're looking for a flaw in T1's game plan or play style, it is like 1 to 10 minutes into the game where they just don't, press the go button nearly as aggressively as some of the other teams. We've seen teams like Hanwha Life Esports and even like KT Rolster to a smaller extent gain advantages over T1 domestically because they are just really aggressive at the pre-10 minute mark. But the problem with FlyQuest going into T1 is probably the most clinical mid to late game team at this tournament, especially like the 20 to 28 minute mark. They're probably the best team in that stage in the world. Like they win games so quickly, and they're able to turn bad situations into good situations so effortlessly that you really have to be on your A game to make sure that you're not throwing advantages that you are able to get early in the game, if you are even able to get them. There is definitely a bit of a talent gap between these two teams basically in every role. Bwipo and Inspired were positives for this team. Are they better than Zeus and Owner? Probably not. Inspired has the opportunity, I think, to be a little bit more aggro in the early game and to potentially generate his own leads there. But outside of that, you're really not looking at a lot of lanes where I think FlyQuest actually has the potential to even really keep up. Bot lane is certainly something that I'm going to be very concerned about going into this series. Busio was not very good in their round 1 win over PSG. There were a lot of mistakes on the Nautilus in that series, and I think if the rest of his team hadn't been so fed, it could have been a bit more difficult to win that, and it's not like Guma and Carrier are going to make it easier than what they had in round number 1 with Betty and Woody, and so I am a bit concerned about Masu and Busio making their international debuts here. Jensen also had a few concerning games in round number 1 against PSG. He was probably the better mid laner, but that was mostly because Maple was just really bad in that first series, and again, Faker's not going to make that any easier in the mid lane. Also adding on, Bwipo is a very good laner, and he's somebody who's been able to generate consistent leads all year long, but Zeus is a different animal. The problem with Zeus has never been the mechanics, it's always been the weird mental mistakes that he makes halfway through the game, being pushed up way too far, not really having any vision. It's kind of the mental part of the game that Zeus has struggled with. I don't think Bwipo is going to be able to generate the same kind of leads that he was able to generate against a lot of LCS competition. So I think there's real concern that this series is just not going to be close. Like, that's what I would expect, more so than FlyQuest really being able to push T1. I think they have a bad matchup in terms of what their players do into T1, and I also think that they are just not as talented. So T1 pretty big favorites coming into this, but are they going to live up to that, or can FlyQuest make things a bit more interesting than anticipated? Well, going game by game means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was T1, they are going to take the first game of this series, and they're not just going to take game number 1, they are going to massacre game number 1. 17 minutes and 34 seconds, a sub-20 game, a sub-18 game here in the first game of this series. It's not quite the 1647 that Mad Lions put out, but man, in theory, it really is like essentially the same thing. Like there is no difference between Mad losing in 1647 and FlyQuest losing in 1734. If you're sub-18 and you're like ending the game, it's a disaster no matter how you want to slice it. The 30 seconds or whatever doesn't actually change a lot in terms of my mentality, but man, T1 looks utterly dominant when they are able to get early game leads. This is the problem that I think like lower teams are going to have against a team like T1. T1 struggles at being able to stay active in the early game. They're just not a team that's designed to be super aggro, and so when they do get early game leads, when they're walking into 10 minutes into the game and they're up like 5k gold, it's over, like, because they're going to play out the mid game so cleanly. That's already their strength, and they're not used to having leads in that stage of the game, that when they have it, it's just not even going to be remotely close, and that's what we saw here for Fly. They actually had a couple of moments, like I guess they got the first good gank off on the top side, and then everything else just completely fell apart around them. It's hard even really to give analysis on this game because everything really went wrong, especially around 10 to 15 minutes into the game. So we'll talk about it. Player of the game, I mean, this was a team effort. You don't win a game in 17 minutes if everybody across the map is not doing super well, but I'm going to give player of the game to Owner. I was really high on Owner last series when they played against Astral. I was really impressed with what he was able to do, mostly in the mid game, which was an area that he wasn't exactly super strong in. Domestically, that was a bit of a weakness for the team, but I thought he played really well. In that series, he did a good job of staying relevant in a lot of those skirmishes, and I think it helped T1 a lot, even if I am lower on Owner as a player. Just in general, I don't think he's quite as elite as some other junglers in the world if you were to like take him off of T1, but this was a good example of what happens when Owner actually does just get to snowball the game out of control, when he does get to be a primary carry. He was everywhere on the map. His aggressive tendencies really come out when he has a gold lead, and that's what makes him so difficult to play with when you have really good laners. Like Zeus was awesome in this game on the Ornn. He obviously fell to that first gank earlier on in the game, but after that he was essentially perfect, outplaying every single bit of aggression that both Whippo and Inspired wanted to throw at him, which there was quite a bit of in the top lane, and then really just pressuring out that top river, really allowing Owner to be more aggro in terms of the skirmishes and the objectives that he wanted to target in the mid game. So credit to Owner, he is definitely the one who did a lot of that. That big fight down in the bot lane around Tribush was really big for him to get those 2 kills, and essentially at that point the game was over. Like you could just snowball the game out of control from there, and Owner could just kind of do whatever he wanted, but he was probably the most impactful member. Zeus was great. Like I almost wanted to give this to Zeus. I want to point out, I've seen a bunch of comments, and I'm sure they're just from LLA fans on my primer video, but if you're watching this, I do want to address this. I've seen a lot of comments where it's like, Zothve gapped Zeus and he solo killed him. You know, how dare you put, we'll talk about this when we see Astral play tomorrow, but how dare you put Zothve so low? Like, Zeus is clearly overrated. I understand that he solo killed him. Did people not watch the rest of that game? Like, did people not see that Zeus was up 4 levels and Flame Horizoned him? Like, did we not like see that part of the game? Like, I understand that he did solo kill him, but Zeus took a bunch of tower shots and just went for a dive that he probably couldn't get away with. Outside of that, Zothve got absolutely slaughtered in that game and in that series as a whole. And so, even I, as somebody who is a bit lower on Zeus, like, I'm not going to sit here and criticize him for something that I don't think he deserves. And I don't think he deserves a lot of criticism for that first series. I don't think he really did all that poorly. Being up 4 levels in 100 CS, that's pretty darn good, all things considered. So, he was really good here too. The 2 players I was most concerned about for T1 going into this tournament, Zeus and Owner, I think both have really stepped it up at the start of the MSI tournament. It's never really been about what they do against bad teams though. The concern for Zeus and Owner has been that they've failed to step up when enemies are actually as good as they are, and that's definitely not been the case as of yet. Faker was really good. Some of those Shreem and Shuffles in lane really doomed Jensen. Some really good plays there. Guma was very consistent on the Senna, didn't make any mistakes. Carry had a couple of good engages. This was a team effort from T1. I'm not going to sit here and say that anyone played bad, because no one played bad, and they just kind of dominated. You don't win in 17 minutes if it's not all 5 members. But for FlyQuest, I mean, you can point the finger at a lot of different people. I'm not really super mad at the bot lane, like Busio flashing to try to get that engage down in the bot lane only to just get completely destroyed in the subsequent fight is not ideal, and I think Busio has definitely been a bit of a concern at this tournament, but Masu was generally fine, and I don't think their laning phase was truly tragic or anything like that. Bwipo and Inspired got that gank off on the top side, but then continued to go for plays on the Ornn and just got demolished over and over and over again. Bwipo's going to get dead of the game for me. His mechanics were just really poor this game. I'm not exactly sure if this is going to be something that's repeatable. Bwipo's always been a bit more of a feast or famine kind of player since he's come over to NA. I know that's not necessarily the scouting report from him on Fnatic, but that's definitely been more of the Team Liquid FlyQuest style of Bwipo playing the more aggressive champions. And we saw what happened when he got into a negative position around 10 to 15 minutes into this game. He just became completely irrelevant on a champion that I don't think is all that good right now. Inspired also is really bad. I hate Graves in this particular draft. You need to be able to establish tempo against T1 early. How do you do that? Graves, Zach, like Orianna, I get it. Like you want to be able to team fight, but now you're playing into T1's strengths in terms of your draft, and I think that that's very weak. Jensen was also very bad this game. Basically accomplished nothing, hit a couple of good shockwaves in team fights, but for the most part was just fodder for Faker to engage upon whenever he really wanted to in the mid lane. So really just a bad game overall for FlyQuest. They are entirely outclassed. They are entirely out of their depth in this series. If they can even make game number 2 close, I think that's going to be a bit of an improvement, but right now T1 just seems to be dominating. Can FlyQuest turn around this series in any kind of way in game 2, or is T1 going to have the most dominant series of the tournament up until this point? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to clean up this series super easily. Not a single tower lost here in the second game, and this was a domination of a series. I mean, I'm not going to say this was the fastest best of 3 of all time, but it's got to be at least in the vicinity. The 27-minute game probably pushes it a bit over the top, but man, this was not close, really, at any point. There were moments, I guess, where FlyQuest was able to bring back some gold in this game. Like, it wasn't the utter stomp that game number 1 was, but it might as well have been. It's not like FlyQuest ever was really in this game. It's not like they ever had a chance to win this game. I think the big takeaway that you have from this is that there is just a gigantic talent gap between these two teams. You can talk about the individual plays that they made, potential macro differences, but T1 got away with so many super risky, super bad plays in this game because they are simply just better than FlyQuest. FlyQuest, at times in this game, were going for plays that I think in a lot of circumstances would get them, resources and get them back into the game, but they just couldn't win any fight because they're just not as talented as T1 is. This is just a bit of a player gap, and there's really nothing else to say. Like, there's not a lot of analysis that I can give you because I think that there are plays in this game that get punished by better teams, and there are plays in this game that work if you're a worse team in T1's case, for FlyQuest. And so, there's not really a ton of back and forth that I can give you. It's just an utter domination. Player of the game for me is going to go to Gumayushi. I really struggled between giving this to Guma or Keria. I think both of them were excellent in this game. I think they played off each other really well. Keria, obviously, a pretty integral piece in whatever level 1 shenanigan happened in the jungle, that 5-kill level 1 fight that lane swaps just kind of invite in terms of the meta. Keria was a big part in getting that lead for T1 early on, but his laning was excellent. His team fighting was excellent. He was probably the most consistent member, but Guma was the one that was cleaning up a lot of these fights. When you're talking about the front-to-back 5v5s, when you're talking about specifically the big skirmishes in the jungle that really kind of set T1 super far ahead in this game, or the dive down in the bot lane, Guma playing it as perfectly as he did really gave T1 their advantage. So if you want to give this to Guma, if you want to give it to Keria, I think the bot lane was definitely the best and most consistent performing member of T1 in this game, but player of the series as a whole for me is going to go to Owner in the jungle. Talked about his game number 1. I thought it was really good. His Sedge in game 2 here was still excellent. A lot of those engages were essentially perfectly timed. I loved that play where Keria threw out Ashe ultimate at the Wukong, made him burn his clone, and then Owner just over the wall throws the Sejuani ultimate onto the other one, and so, you're guaranteed to get CC on somebody, on one of the Wukong clones. It's a really fun play. It's really good synergy between the players, but Owner was excellent in this series, and I think he has started off MSI really well. A player who has always stepped it up more when games matter more, or at least when he actually has to go and try. I'm not sure if it is that. He struggled a bit in the regular season as a player, even when it does feel like he's going out there attempting to make plays. Maybe it's just the rest of the team clicking in a way. Maybe it's the communication. I don't know, but Owner has always performed better internationally than he has domestically, and this is another, I think, pretty good example of that. Faker was really good on the Taliyah. You don't often see Faker going for some of these YOLO plays, but he was definitely going for some some in this game, these 50-50s that he was able to get away with because he is just straight up better than everybody that he's playing against. And then Zeus. I mean, this is not Zeus in the top lane, it's the Shy. There's really not a bunch of other analysis that I can give on that. There are good and bad moments of what Zeus has done at this tournament, but for the most part, he is so much more talented than everybody that he's going up against here in the play-in stage that he's able to get away with a lot of really bad plays, a couple of really crazy fights where he gets chunked out to half right at the beginning. The entire FlyQuest team tries to kill him, and then T1 just kind of group and turn it, and Zeus ends up dying anyways. Like, it's a very funny circumstance, but Zeus was, I think, more of a positive than a negative towards his team in this game. But Owner was excellent. Guma and Keria, I thought, were really excellent. Faker could get away with a lot. T1 just looks really good. They are too good for the play-in stage, and they proved that. They are now out of the play-in stage. They are done. They're in the main stage. Not a shock here to see a 2-0. A little bit shocking to see it as dominant as it was, but these two teams were not even remotely close. And then for Fly on the other side of this matchup, again, maybe some of these plays end up working if you're playing against a different team, if you're playing against different players, but because you're playing against T1, because you are at such a talent disadvantage, or at least from what we saw in this series, a talent disadvantage, none of these plays ended up working. I feel so bad for Masu, who I think generally was FlyQuest's best player in this series. Inspired's scoreline looks okay, but I thought he made a lot of really bad plays on the Wukong, going in way too early, not being connected with the rest of his team. Bwipo, I think, made a couple of good plays, was pretty solid in a side lane, especially going one-on-one with Zeus, more so than in game number 1, but some of his team fighting mistakes and his over-aggression were definitely problematic as well. Some macro mistakes in terms of what they want to do in team fights with the Gragas, it just wasn't ideal. And the dead of the game for me is going to go to Busio on the Nautilus. He has just not been good at this champion the entirety of this tournament. We talked about it in round number 1. We talked about it a bit with a player like Redbert yesterday, where if you're engaging on Nautilus and the rest of your team is just not there to follow up, then you're a bad Nautilus. Like, the game is not going your way. And that's what we saw out of Busio here. Just not a good performance from FlyQuest. I don't really want to hammer this down like too much. Jensen was also clearly worse than Faker. A couple of good team fights from him, but like clearly he was outclassed as well. Just not a good series from Fly. They have to go down into the lower bracket now. Hopefully they can maintain some of their confidence because they clearly should be the best of the rest. Like, they should still be getting out of the play-in stage, but this certainly does bring a lot more question marks, I would say, into their performances. But T1 never deserved to be here in the same way that I don't think Top Esports deserves to be here. These two teams are just so much better than the teams that they're going up against. Even a team like FlyQuest, who is a major region team, T1 is just so clearly better, and it's really not even particularly close. Congratulations to them. They're in the main stage. It would have been a disaster if there was any other result, but this is what you expected and wanted to see out of T1 here. But then moving on now to our second series, and it is our Group B winners finals. We saw the first team to qualify for the main stage from the play-ins in T1 in that first series, but who is going to be joining them? Will it be the number 2 seed from the LPL in Top Esports or the number 2 seed from the LEC in Fnatic? This is, I would say, kind of similar on paper to the series that we just talked about with T1 and FlyQuest, but like I said in the breakdown of that series, I think FlyQuest is worse than Fnatic, and I think that there is a little bit of a difference. They're like same tier to me, but I think Fnatic has significantly more upside than a team like FlyQuest does, which is why they came up at the top of that C tier for me in terms of my power rankings, mostly because I think that there are some players here who just simply play better when the lights are bright or when the games matter more. Players like Humanoid in particular have played a lot better when games really start to get more important. Someone like Razork, I think, could have a very good tournament. We've seen him perform well internationally in the past. Someone like Oscarinin, I think, has had good moments when games matter more. He just struggles a bit when games don't matter at all, and obviously it depends on the champions that he plays, but I still think when you're looking at the series, Top Esports have to be considered pretty heavy favorites. They are simply more talented in most areas across the board. I think top lane is a major advantage for them. It's probably the best top laner in the world right now in 369, going into Oscarinin, who I identified as probably the biggest weakness on Fnatic so far in 2024. You've got Jackie Love and Mako taking on Noah and June. Noah and June have absolutely been better as of late. They were really good down the stretch in the playoffs in the spring split, but Jackie Love and Mako to me are a top 2 bot lane in the world. I made the comment in their round 1 series where I said that I think, you know, there's always one player or one kind of lane that really stands out from a major international tournament that people go like, oh, you know, they're part of the story of the tournament, even if the team doesn't win. I called my shot in round number 1 of the play-ins, and I said that Jackie Love is going to be the player that, you know, people kind of remember how good he is because he hasn't had that international experience in the last couple of years. I think people have forgotten that Jackie Love is a top 2 to 380 carry in the world, and I think this tournament's going to be there to remind a lot of people. Noah and June are certainly going to have to live up up to some of the expectations that they had at the end of the spring split in order to even really match that. But I do think that Fnatic has more of an opportunity. We talked about how FlyQuest had a really bad matchup into T1, and that's why I really didn't feel like that series was going to be close, because a lot of their strengths were T1 strengths, and so I didn't really see a lot of avenues for them to be able to, you know, kind of outdo them in that stage of the game. But Fnatic actually has quite a few lanes that match up pretty well into top esports, specifically jungle mid. If Humanoid can play his international style that he has played over the last couple of years, we saw it in 2022, we saw it in 2023, where he just gets a little bit better at Worlds. He definitely plays a bit more consistent in those games. You know, Tian and Cream are definitely more of the exploitable members of top esports, and so if Razork and Huma can have a good series, then maybe Fnatic can make this relatively close. But top esports are definitely still favorites, and they should be favorites going into a series like this. I think Fnatic's going to be looking to take at least one game. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that, but that's certainly going to be on the hope list for them. So we'll see if they're able to do that. But, you know, of course, that means we get to go game by game, starting with game one. And the winner of game number one was Top Esports. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this was a close game, especially in comparison to what we had seen out of, you know, T1 versus FlyQuest. This was significantly closer. I think a lot of people are going to look at this and say that, you know, Fnatic actually had a real chance to win this game. I'm a little bit lower on what Fnatic did here, at least from what I've seen from public opinion. They certainly didn't go down without a fight. I'm not trying to say that they just rolled over and died, or that they didn't play well in certain areas in this game, but I think that there were a lot of people that said it was super close at around 20-25 minutes into the game. I didn't really see that. I saw a game where Fnatic was getting small gold pieces on the margins. Like they were making plays, but the plays were just kind of, I don't want to say inconsequential plays, but they were certainly not like major plays in the game, and they never really addressed their major flaw, which is the fact that they had no way of actually dealing with Lucian. And so we'll talk about that. It was really funny watching this game. Fnatic was up, I think, 5 kills at 20 minutes. I think it was like 10-5 in terms of kills. They had a lot of pressure on the map, and I could see this idea where it's like, oh, Fnatic are actually in a really good spot here, but then you look at the gold difference, and they're down like 4k gold because all of it is on the Lucian, and Jackie Love just completely outplayed Noah and June in the laning phase, and you got to this point where they just didn't have an answer, and that's why Jackie Love's going to be a pretty easy choice for player of the game. Completely dominated this matchup. Lucian's one of those champs that I think gets a bad rap, if only because he is very skill-intensive, and I know it doesn't necessarily feel like that. Like there are other AD carries that I would say have more mechanical like execution. Not that Lucian has never come up on that role, but I think in terms of the way that you play Lucian, the difference between a good Lucian and a bad Lucian is more apparent than I think a lot of other AD carries in the meta right now, because you do have to have the kind of mentality where you can get super far ahead on Lucian in order to make the most of him. But Jackie Love was just unbelievable in game number one here. I mean, truly decimated that laning phase, just kept getting further and further ahead. He got a couple of kills at the Void Grub fight around 13-ish minutes into the game, and then from there on, it was just unplayable for Fnatic. They were, you know, credit to Fnatic, like I said, they were able to get a lot of gold on the margins. They were able to pick off members in side lanes. They were able to get Cream and Tian, you know, a couple of times caught out, and they were able to, you know, get these kills and really put pressure on the map. But at the end of the day, they were never going to be able to win this game if they couldn't deal with Jackie Love, and they just didn't have a real answer for him, and that ended up being a bit of a problem. I do want to give a lot of credit to Mako as well. We always say this on the channel. This has kind of become a pretty regular thing for me to talk about, but Lucian gets a lot of credit for the Lucian Nami lane. I think Nami is more valuable and certainly can have a bigger swing on that lane depending on how good the Nami player is than people give that champion credit for. Mako is a very good Nami player. If you are consistently lining up your ultimates in a good way in team fights, if you can hit your bubbles reliably, even on multiple members, that's a very valuable trait to have to set up everything else that the team wants to do. And I thought Mako was really excellent in this game. 369 was also pretty good, ended up dying to that 3v1 on the top side early on, but outside of that was pretty good in terms of the engages. Cassante can just be very difficult. I thought his teleports were always really well timed, and he was very active in trying to get on the backline for Fnatic, disrupting what they wanted to do. It meant that Aphelios couldn't do nearly the same kind of output as Lucian, even if he was on a similar playing field in terms of gold, which he absolutely wasn't. Tian and Cream definitely created some questionable opportunities in this game. I think Tian was definitely worse for Top Esports. He, at times, was just really out of position, really not in a good spot. His team fighting could have been cleaned up a lot, and his macro decisions, I think, were just a bit disconnected from the rest of the team, but, you know, Jackie Love was certainly strong enough to be able to push them over the top, and so you are a bit concerned that they weren't able to decimate this game, but, I mean, 11 towers to 1. Jackie Love never really was in any danger. He was able to take over all these fights. It was a clean game, just maybe not in the way that you would necessarily call, you know, some other games clean. And then for Fnatic, I want to give credit specifically to Humanoid. I thought he was unbelievably good in this game. You know, we talked about it. Humanoid always saves his best performances for international games. He's always been a bit of a coaster, I would say. Domestically, he is somebody who clearly just has that like mental check-in, check-out kind of thing. Whether you want to say that's a good or a bad thing, that's just clear. It's been clear that that's what Humanoid is. He's somebody who just doesn't really try domestically, and then he gets international and he actually shows what he can do. But this was an amazing LeBlanc game. He was constantly getting advantages for his team. The problem was he was never really able to actually stick on the Lucian. Give a lot of credit to the Peel on the side of TES, and give a lot of credit to Jackie Love, whose positioning was excellent. But, you know, if it was the LeBlanc versus the Lucian, you would typically imagine that LeBlanc would come out on top. That's just not how it went here. And unfortunately, the bot lane was also a bit of a problem. Noah is a very easy choice for dead of the game, just got completely outplayed here in game number 1. If he went even, like even remotely even in this game with Jackie Love, if he wasn't down 8k gold by the end of this game individually as a player, I think there's a real chance that Fnatic could win this game, but that just wasn't the case. Jackie Love got so fed by 15 minutes that Fnatic did have to look to a lot of these side lanes in order to get their advantages. They had to ignore the problem, and eventually they just couldn't ignore it any longer, and that ended up coming back to bite them, and Noah was a big part of that. June, I don't think was as bad on the Lulu, really not all that much you can do, but Noah, super passive, and honestly, his mechanics were really poor in game number 1, so that's something to monitor. Razork was also very useless in fights, but he is Xin Zhao. The champion's just not all that relevant in fights, and he didn't have a lead, and that's kind of what Razork does. He's not great in team fights when he has to play from behind. Oscar Renan was generally fine. I mean, it was Sion. Like, he didn't really have a lot of ways to do things. I thought some of the ultimates were wasted, but at the same time, it's Sion. Like, you're just naturally useful in some of these late fights anyways because of just how much damage you can tank up. But overall, for Fnatic, you did put in a good effort, certainly better than anything we saw at a FlyQuest here in game 1, but you're going to have to focus a bit more on the actual carries if you want to win a game like this. And for TES, if you can just get your star players in good positions, even if it's just one of them, that's probably enough to be able to win a game here against Fnatic and to be able to sweep this series. So a big game 2 here, obviously. Both teams want to win it. Fnatic does not want to go down to lower bracket, but Top Esports has the potential to move their way into the main stage. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up the series at 1 apiece, and we are going to a game number 3. This is what I'm talking about. This is what I wanted to see out of Fnatic. I wanted to see them play up to the standard that they play at their absolute best. We know that this team can be inconsistent. We know that there are going to be times where they just don't show up, but when they do show up, they look pretty damn good, and they've looked pretty good across this series so far. It is clear that they had a game plan going into it. It is clear that they had a pretty good scouting report on what Top Esports was going to be playing, or at least what they were going to be investing in as well, and I think they've done a great job of capitalizing on the known information while also translating a lot of the advantages that they're able to get into mid to late game advantages, being consistent in that regard. This was a really clean game from Fnatic. Really not a lot to criticize for Top Esports. You made a lot of mistakes, and you made quite a few mistakes in game number 1 as well. It's really starting to show up. There were a couple of players that I think, quite frankly, just kind of got gapped in this one. And that's really not something I expected, and the players that got gapped were not the ones I expected to get gapped. You still had some positives, and there's still things to point to as good things for this team moving forward, but you have to be better than what you were in game number 2, or else you could be facing a major upset. If this team loses this series, that is a disaster for Top Esports and for their confidence moving in to the rest of this tournament. So let's go ahead and talk about game 2. Player of the game, maybe controversially here, is going to go to Jun for me. I thought he really was that good down in the support position on the Renata. You can talk about how great Humanoid was, and I agree. Humanoid was excellent once again on the LeBlanc. Second game in a row where he is constantly creating advantages for the rest of the team. You can talk about how Oscar Renan, quite frankly, gapped 369. I don't think it was quite that black and white, like in terms of what happened in the top lane. I think 369 was generally fine for a lot of this game and then just slowly became more and more irrelevant as the Camille just got more and more out of control. But I think when you're talking about the plays that were created, the reason Fnatic was in such a good spot for a majority of this game, it was Jun on the Renata. He was unbelievably good in this game. I mean, we were wondering whether or not that playoff form was going to be replicable for him moving forward. Well, newsflash, I guess it is. Like, this is a player who has been mediocre at best the entirety of his career, going back to Challengers League where he was good but not great, going back to the LCK with the Guangdong Freaks where he was bad, like the worst bot lane in the league, and then, you know, even Winter Split on Fnatic, he wasn't particularly great to watch, but he figured something out in the Spring Split, and clearly it is still clicking for him, because this was a dominating game. Of course, Renata Ultimate can be huge and can completely take over a fight, but those handshakes were genuinely game-breaking as well, especially the flash handshake under tower early in the game. It was just really, really great stuff. His play in the mid lane that completely opened everything up. Like, there are multiple moments in this game that I think Fnatic just don't do nearly as well without Jun here on on the Renata, and that's why he's going to get player of the game for me. But again, it wasn't just him. Oscar Rinnan was unbelievable in this game, and that is not something I expected to say in this series. Oscar has always been a player that's played a bit better, not only with resources, but also in circumstances that matter a bit more. It's kind of generally just the MO of this Fnatic team is that they don't really try all that much in the regular season, and they make a lot of weird mistakes, but, you know, these players have good moments and bad moments. Well, this was a good moment for Oscar, who can be pretty coin flippy. He was unbelievable on the Camille, clearly knew the matchup incredibly well. The 1v1s up on the top side were very in favor of Oscar Rinnan. A lot of the trades early on in the game were pretty neutral, but as the game continued to go along, you just saw the Camille get more and more out of control. Sterix is really strong right now, and it really made that Camille unkillable. The 1v2 in the top lane, I think, kind of solidified the idea behind that with 369 and Mako both going down. In that instance, this is the best game Oscar has played in a very long time, and to do it against 369, to do it on an international stage, very impressive stuff. Humanoid was also excellent. Second game in a row where he is just really, really good, and he's been better than Cream, like very, very clearly across these first two games. Certainly something to monitor. We'll talk about Cream, but Humanoid is very proficient at LeBlanc, and they don't have an answer to that, which I think is very interesting. And then Razork and Noah were also fine. Razork was good. Noah was generally fine. I'm still not super sold on how Noah played this game, as Kalista was, quite frankly, irrelevant for a majority of it, but the rest of the team was certainly good enough to be able to push them to a win for Top Esports. Yeah, I'm concerned. I'm at least a little bit concerned here for them, because there were real moments in this game where it's like, you should not be falling to these traps. You should not be underperforming and making these mechanical mistakes. You're not supposed to be the team that does that. You were pretty good at being executing, I'll say, throughout the regular season and especially throughout the playoffs. And it just didn't feel like this was that team. Cream is a very easy choice for dead of the game. R5 Ari, one of his best picks. He is very good on this champion, and he's always been very good, specifically in assassin versus assassin matchups. And that's essentially what this is, or at least how it plays out, but he got completely outplayed by Humanoid. He was missing charm after charm after charm. It just didn't feel like a pretty traditional Cream game. It feels like he is a bit nervous. Like, that has to be, like, really the takeaway from this, is Cream is looking a bit overmatched at an international level. Maybe not in terms of mechanics, but in terms of mental, and that's something that we're just going to have to monitor. But the top side of the map in general just kind of let them down. 369 did get outplayed by Oscar Rinnan. You know, I think some people are going to overblow it, because I don't think 369 was horrid in this game, but he wasn't good. Like, I'm not trying to sit here and say that he was a winning player. He was a losing player for this team, which is not what you want to see. Tion lost a lot of pressure in the early game, and that Xin Zhao had the opposite effect of what, you know, Fnatic had in game number one. It was useless for Fnatic. Now here it was useless for Top Esports in a lot of these fights, trying to fight back from a gold deficit. I think Jackie Love and Mako were fine. Mako was out of position a bit in the late game, but he was also really the only one making plays in the early game, and so I'm going to cut him a bit of slack, and Jackie Love continues to really be the only player on this team that's not making major mistakes and locking himself in, but this is concerning for Top Esports. You know, Fnatic was doing a good job to keep themselves in game one, even though they were at a gold deficit the entirety of the game. And here they are winning game number two. This game three is definitely an intriguing one. If Fnatic wins this, that is a major upset and a huge, huge blow to Top Esports into the LPL. But TES still have the opportunity to right the ship, to come out on top, to play something, and that's a little bit more comfortable to them, to maybe get a little bit more confidence under their belt. This is a big game three. Both teams are going to want to win it, but only one can. Who's going to take it? Who's going to be moving on to the main stage? Well, the winner of game number three was Top Esports. They are gonna take game number three. They're gonna take this series 2-1, and with as close as games 1 and 2 were, it's a little bit disappointing to see it go out on this game three, which was just not close. It was pure destruction from the side of TES, by far the least close game of the series. They were better basically in every aspect of the game. A lot of the things that Fnatic was doing well at the beginning of this series were just not applicable towards the back half of this series, but big credit to Fnatic for hanging in there through the first two games. I don't want it to seem like I'm trying to dig on this team. This just was a really fun series, and unfortunately just didn't end the way that you might have wanted it to as a Fnatic fan. We'll talk about some of the things that went wrong for them, but credit to Top Esports for hanging in there, for losing game two, for maybe not being as dominant as you wanted to be across the board in game number one. Players like Tion and Cream not looking all that great in the first couple games of this series. Even 369 not looking all that great in the first couple games of this series, but hanging on to some of the things you do really well and pushing through it. So let's talk about it. Let's talk at least about what happened here in game three. Player of the game for me is going to go to Cream. I don't think this is like guaranteed. I think Jackie Love was also incredible in this game in terms of his positioning, but I thought Cream was a little bit more active in terms of the plays that were made across the map. Of course, he dies at level 1, which is a bit of a disaster for Top Esports. It puts them behind pretty early on in the game, but one thing that became a big trend, I would say, throughout this series is kind of the the East versus West, like, old international gap that we used to see. I'm not saying that, oh, the gap is huge. I think there's an argument to be made. Obviously, the gap is huge. But going back to, like, 2015, 2016, when we talked about, like, East versus West games, like LCK versus, I remember at the time it was specifically around, like, LCK versus LCS, you would always see the same things. You would always see, the lower region team, the Western team, getting kills. You would see them being able to pick up small advantages around the map, but then you'd look at the gold lead and it was always still like 3 or 4K in favor of LCK or LPL teams. And this is what that series felt like. It felt like Fnatic was doing a good job of pushing the tempo, of finding opportunities in side lanes, of finding picks in random areas and, pushing their pseudo advantages on the map. But then you look at the gold lead and it just was never in favor of them. I think that was really something that kind of stood out, and I think Fnatic did a good job of staying interesting, but Top Esports was just a little bit more clinical. And, I bring that up to say, like, even with Cream getting caught at level 1, even with Fnatic having a couple of good fights, you look at the gold lead even at 5 to 10 minutes, and it's Top Esports up 1k gold, it's Top Esports up 2k gold, even with Fnatic making all of these plays early, and it just made it so much easier for Top Esports to play some of these fights where Fnatic was trying to be really aggressive, most notably that fight in the bottom side of the map, like early on in the game, like right near first dragon, that Fnatic took and really wanted to try and punish, and all of a sudden everything got pushed back on them. They didn't have the same kind of combat power that they thought they had because Top Esports had done such a great job in their isolated laning phases of generating massive leads. Now, a lot of that goes to the bot lane, who were just so much better in the isolated 2v2, but part of that goes to Cream as well, who was excellent in this game. And when you're watching a lot of these late game team fights, you're watching this Tristana, seeing if she can get the resets and watching her bounce around these fights for a player who was struggling in the first 2 games, who had a really bad game number 2, to see Top Esports go to kind of the tried and true jungle mid duo here throughout the playoffs of Maokai plus Tristana that I was raving up before MSI started, to see them go back to the picks that their region really popularized and really succeed on it. It is a good sign to see them go back to comfort and really work on it. So Cream was really good here, was really active in the early game even after that death, but player of the series as a whole is absolutely going to go to JackeyLove. The dude just mega gapped Noah, and we're going to talk about Noah in just a second. He was down 50 or so CS in this game playing Xayah into Varus, which is just a disaster. I mean, it's worst case scenario. Noah was just not good at all in this series, but JackeyLove has to be commended for that. It's not just Noah being bad, it's the fact that JackeyLove really is that good. He is that much better than a lot of the other people that he's going to be playing into at this tournament, and, hopefully I look good, and I continue to look good for that take of, I think a lot of people are going to be talking a lot about JackeyLove coming out of this tournament more than a lot of other players, because I think people have forgotten how good he is. That has aged well so far because he has been sensational through their first 2 series. Player of the series, in my opinion, in both, and maybe has been the best player at MSI so far. He really has been that good. Mako was also solid. I think some of the arrows could have been a bit more clinical. They were just kind of throwing him out by the time you hit the late game, but that's Ashe support. It just kind of is what it is, but Mako was also fine. He tried to 1v1 Humanoid and almost won in the mid game. Truly unbelievable. That's the kind of Mako that I want to see. It just didn't end up working out, but still a very good game from him. And I think 369 and Tian were better in this game than they were in game number 2. Tian maybe not as much. I think he was good at frontlining, and I think that was a role that as soon as they moved him into more of a facilitator and he felt less of a need to carry, I think the team actually played better. I think the composition worked a bit better for the players on the team, and 369 was definitely more cohesive here on the Renekton, even if he was the one that just kind of was going in and dying in these fights. That was his role, was to go in, get a lot of damage off, and then just die, and he did that well. So credit to Top Esports. It was a lot rockier than maybe you would have wanted it to be, but it was still at least okay. And then for Fnatic, you tried your best, but game 3 just wasn't meant to be for you. Dead of the game for me is going to go to Humanoid. This was one of the weaker games at the tournament, in my opinion. I know people are going to look at Noah, and trust me, we will get to him. He was bad across the whole series, but I think when you're talking specifically about who was worse in game 3, Humanoid was really bad on the Taliyah, and that sucks because he was so good in games 1 and 2. He was such a positive factor for this team. He was better than Cream in the first 2 games of this series, but the Taliyah was just not working. Multiple times where he's just dying by himself in a side lane, whether it's to Cream, in the mid lane getting dove and dying 1v1, whether it's dying twice to 369 in, a solo lane 1v1. Or whether it's interrupting 369's teleport and completely screwing over his own team because he interrupts 369 teleporting immediately into 4 members. He almost certainly would have died. He interrupts that, and then he takes the fight with 369 and dies and gets solo killed. It truly was a disaster class from Humanoid, but it wasn't just him. Like we said, Noah had a really bad series here, all things considered. Just his laning was horrible. Like, he could not even survive in the lane against JackeyLove and Mako, and if that's going to be a recurring trend throughout the rest of this run, like, they're not going to have a shot to be be able to beat any of the top tier teams, no matter how well anybody else on this team is playing. Jun was very good in this series. Oscar kind of defaulted back to the Oscar we know and love after that really good game number 2. And, I don't think Razork was all that bad, but was certainly inconsequential. It's just unfortunate that game 3 was such a letdown, I'll say, all things considered, after how close the series was leading up until this point. Fnatic is not eliminated. This is their extra life. They go down into the lower bracket. Now they face the winner of Loud versus Gam, which is super winnable for them. They should still be able to get out of this group without really any troubles, especially with all the good things that they showed here. I just think they're going to be a little bit disappointed that they didn't at least come a bit closer to winning this series in game number 3. But for TES, you're thanking your lucky stars you're able to walk out of this with the win. Games 1 and 2 certainly made you sweat if you were a TES or an LPL fan, but they ended up getting over it and they ended up getting the job done. So congratulations to them. They move on to the main stage. Hopefully they can clean up some of the errors that they made, but if they play more standard comps like they did in game 3, I still think this team can be very dangerous. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI Play-Ins Day 3 overview and analysis video. We know our first 2 teams to qualify for the main stage, at least out of the Play-Ins, T1 and Top Esports. No major surprises there. Perhaps one series was closer than expected, and maybe perhaps one series was much more of a blowout than expected, but both of the teams that we expected to be going out as the number 1 seeds are going out as the number 1 seeds. It's now going to be the lower bracket, the losers bracket, if you will, over the next couple of days. We've got Astral versus PSG tomorrow. We've got Loud versus Gam tomorrow. Both of those are going to be very fun. My predictions, I think PSG should clearly be better than Astral. I know people are really hyped up on Astral right now, but I think people are overlooking PSG's more controlled style, and I just don't think that Astral really has the talent to be able to keep up with that. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Maybe that series against T1 was better than I'm predicting it to be, or that I reviewed it to be, but I think PSG should pretty handily take care of that. And as for Loud versus Gam, with everything that Gam showed in round 1, I think Loud are going to be pretty big favorites going into that. So I would expect PSG and Loud to be the teams to move on, but I would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions down below. Do you agree with my predictions for tomorrow? Do you agree with my analysis of the games today? Would love to know your thoughts on everything down below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're posting about every single day of MSI here on this channel, so if you want a comprehensive overview of the entire tournament, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.